Greetings, class, and welcome back to our discussion of American history. In the last couple of videos, we were looking at the Great Depression in the United States. This video here will not talk about the United States. It's really going to be focused on Europe and Asia, but we're setting the stage for World War II. All right. So just keep in mind that what we talk about today is happening at the same time as the Roaring Twenties, which we discussed in the last section, and the Great Depression, which we have discussed in this section. All right. Also keep in mind that some of the depression that we're in is not just a U.S. depression, but a global depression. So lots of countries in the world are experiencing the same depression that we're in. Also, we're going to call this the interwar period. So we're talking about the interwar period. We're talking about the gap between World War I and World War II. For Americans, it's pretty easy to separate those two conflicts, World War I and World War II. In fact, we studied one in the last section. We're studying this one in this section. So we've separated them, by some type of break. However, in world history or European history, World War I and World War II need to be studied together. You cannot have World War II without World War I. They go together. So we've put a lot of space between them in this course because of the way this course is designed with a U.S. focus. Just keep in mind that these events are a lot more interconnected when studying them from a European perspective or a world perspective. All right, so one of the things that we need to take into account, if we go back to the end of World War I, and we remember Wilson's 14 points and things like that, a lot of the talk was around the idea of self-determination. All right, self-determination is basically that a nation or a state has the right to sort of choose its own path. And so self-determination and imperialism or colonialism, those two things really don't go together. And so we know in the last section we talked a lot about imperialism, but really after World War I and definitely after World War II, we start to see, the end of colonialism. And so people are trading out those, old ideas of imperialism for embracing this idea of self-determination, with some exceptions, and we'll look at those. But if we remember, after World War I, what we called the Central Powers, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, those empires were destroyed because of the war. And then the Russian Empire, which was one of the Allied powers, it was also destroyed through civil war, through the February and October revolutions, and then the Russian Civil War that followed. So the map of Europe is going to look very different after World War I than it did in the decades leading up to World War I. And so we're going to have some new nations here, and we're going to talk about those nations. All right, so the first one we need to talk about is the Soviet Union. So if you remember the Russian Revolution of 1917, we had the February Revolution where the Emperor of Russia, the Tsar of Russia, stepped down. And then in the October Revolution, the communists, called the Bolsheviks, overthrew the provisional government. This led to a war, a Russian Civil War, which the Bolsheviks or the communists ultimately won. And through those wars, we get something established called the Soviet Union. So by 1922, the Soviet Union is official. It is primarily comprised of Russia, but not just Russia. So it's easy sometimes when you're talking about the Soviet Union to say the Russians or Russia, but really it's a little bit bigger than that. So we have Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and then some of the Caucasus in sort of Central Asia, Eastern Europe. It is one-party rule, so it is ruled by the Communist Party. It is a totalitarian regime, and it basically controls pretty much every economic aspect of life. All right, so when we see all land, industry, and businesses nationalized, when you see the word nationalized, like an industry gets nationalized, that's a communist thing. So that what that means is the government has taken possession of whatever it is, right? If it's farms, then the government owns the farms. If it's industry, then the government owns the industries, right? So communism's not, it's something you should already be familiar with because we've talked about it in previous sections. But it's basically, if we go back to Karl Marx and we talk about how he wanted the workers to rise up and overthrow the industrialists and the middle class. He wanted private property eliminated, so all property would be owned by the government. And so that's what we see in practice here in the Soviet Union. Now, just to be clear, because somebody's going to, make the comment, the Soviet Union, although it claims to be communist, it was in fact socialist. All right, no nation has ever, truly achieved communism, because communism would mean that the government has ceased to exist, at least as Marx defined it. All right, so when we talk about, for example, today the Chinese Communist Party, this Communist Party that rules the Soviet Union, the fact that those are parties running the government is sort of antithetical of communism, because Marx said once you had socialism and you achieved communism, you wouldn't need a government anymore. All right, just keep that in mind. All right, so after Lenin, if you remember, Vladimir Lenin is sort of seen as the founder of the Soviet Union. After he dies, he is replaced by Joseph Stalin. Stalin, again, he's sort of an authoritarian dictator. He is going to create what's called the 5-year plan. This is his plan to get the Soviet Union economically viable through industry and agriculture. And he wants to establish an autarky. You see that word there, autarky. That means self-sufficiency, right? So he wants the Soviet Union to be self-sufficient. And so that's his plan. The 5-year plan is to make this happen. Now this comes along with something called the Great Purge. Basically, anybody who disagrees with Stalin or the Communist Party is going to be punished. All right, so a lot of times that could just mean killed. It could also mean thrown into some type of political prison or re-education camp. And so, this is, one of the things that tends to accompany one-party rule in socialist or communist countries. If you disagree with the government, bad things usually happen to you. All right, here we have the Kellogg-Briand Pact. All right, this was created after World War I with the hopes of preventing further wars. Now, the fact that we call World War I today ought to show you the irony of this, because we wouldn't call it World War I unless there was a World War II. So, for example, in 1928, no one called World War I World War I. They called it the Great War. It wasn't really World War I until we had World War II to sort of frame it. But this was a plan to try to keep wars from happening, and obviously it didn't work. It's named after an American and a Frenchman. All right, so the American is U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg. The Frenchman is Aristide Briand. And so that, we have this multinational agreement here, which ultimately doesn't work. All right, so fascism. Fascism is something that originates in Italy, and the name is tied back to the Roman Empire. But when we use the term fascism today, we're talking about radical authoritarian nationalism. A lot of times people will tie this to the right, the political right. So, they'll say that's a right-wing thing as opposed to communism or socialism, which is a left-wing thing. But interestingly, the fascism has its roots in the left as well. So it's interesting how people, frame certain things these days. So what happens here in Italy? Italy is technically a monarchy. All right, it has a king, but there is an event called the March on Rome, in which Benito Mussolini, he's the founder of the Italian fascist party, he basically takes over the government as prime minister. Now, the king doesn't go anywhere. The king is still the king, but the real power is going to lay with Mussolini. All right. So in this fascist government, it's basically super nationalism and super authoritarian. So it is, there's a lot of it's a lot about embracing, the pride of being who you are, in this case Italian, but anybody that goes against the state is going to be persecuted, similar to what we saw in the communist countries. So typically in a fascist society, you're going to have a dictator who's usually a military dictator. And you're going to have a military and police force that sort of run the country. So they're sort of the elites. If you think about the old, we think about the days of there being lords and ladies and dukes and duchesses and all that. There was an aristocracy, right? The nobility. Well, fascism is sort of replacing that nobility with sort of a military nobility, a state nobility, right? So people who work for the government is the aristocracy. All right, Japan. So this period between the wars, Japan is sometimes called Showa Japan or Showa, the Showa era, Showa period. That word Showa is actually referencing the emperor. We'll talk more about him in a second. But this period of Japan, we see them embracing ultra-nationalism, militarism, and fascism. So very similar to what we see in Italy, where Japan becomes ultra-nationalist. They're super proud to identify as Japanese, to the point that they believe that the Japanese race is the master Asian race. They begin increasing their war industries and increasing their imperialist ambitions. Now remember, we've mentioned this previously, that Japan is an island, right? Or a chain of islands. And so it's very similar to Great Britain in that its resources at home are limited. Its domestic resources are limited. So it really, if it wants to compete on the global stage, it's going to have to colonize other places like England has done. All right, so Japan and England, very similar in that regard. So this word Showa, so Showa is the emperor. All right, he's the Emperor Showa. However, most of the time in America, we refer to him as Hirohito, which is his name. All right, so his name is Hirohito, but he assumes the name Showa as emperor. He's actually going to be the emperor for a long time. So all the way until the 1980s. So when we see, let me put it this way, it's interesting that we tend to look at this period of Japanese history and that it really ends after World War II, but it technically doesn't. I mean, this guy's going to stay emperor even after the war, which is an interesting case, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, now this actually predates World War I, but we need to mention it. All right, so in 1911 in China, there was a revolution called the Shanghai Revolution, or the 1911 Revolution. This is the end of the Qing dynasty, right? So the Qing dynasty, if you remember, we talked about this before, China is not ruled by Chinese people, it's ruled by Manchus, right? People from Manchuria. So the last Chinese dynasty is not really a Chinese dynasty at all. It's a dynasty that rules China, but it's not Chinese. All right, so this 1911 revolution ends the Qing dynasty and imperial rule of China and starts the Republic of China. All right, now be careful. Do not confuse the Republic of China with what China is today, which is the People's Republic of China. All right. In fact, there are two Chinas today, and the Republic of China still exists. It's just not where you think it is, and we're going to talk more about that later in this course. All right. But in 1911, China becomes the Republic of China. All right. Now this guy, Sun Yat-sen, He is considered the first president of the Republic of China. He's considered sort of the father of, modern China or Republican China. He is the leader of the Kuomintang. All right. Now that word there, sometimes you'll see that spelled with a G. It's just when you take letters that don't use the Latin alphabet, right? So, for example, Chinese writing doesn't use our alphabet. When you Romanize those words, right? So you're not translating them, but you're turning the letters into something we can sort of read with our alphabet. Sometimes there's a disagreement on how things should be spelled. So you often get multiple spellings of Chinese words, Arabic words, Russian words, things like that. All right. So the Kuomintang is the Nationalist Party of China. This is the Chinese Nationalist Party, which is going to be our ally, and we'll learn more about that later. All right, now in 1931, Japan, who we've been talking about, invades Manchuria, right? Not China, at least not what is historically considered China, but Manchuria, which is where the Qing dynasty was originally located, right? So they're going to take over Manchuria and they're going to rename it Manchukuo, which is basically a puppet state. All right, so a puppet state means that it seems to be ruled, by Manchurians, but ultimately the Japanese are pulling the strings. Now, this would get some negative attention on Japan, but Japan is able to justify this through nationalism, right? They're saying, hey, these people aren't Chinese. They shouldn't be ruled by Chinese people. They should be ruled by Manchurians. But really, Japan's ruling it, all right? But what Japan does is they prop up a puppet government under the Emperor Puyi. All right, Puyi was the last emperor of China. All right, so he's from that Qing family, the Qing dynasty. Now remember that the 1911 revolution ended the Qing dynasty. So this is 1931, so this is 20 years later. But Puyi was a little boy. He was a little boy when he was the last emperor of China. So now he's a grown man, and he's the quote-unquote emperor of Manchukuo, but really he doesn't have any power. He does what Japan tells him to. All right, 1933, Japan withdraws from the League of Nations, which is interesting. Remember, the League of Nations was supposed to be this association of nations to prevent further wars and things like that. And if you remember, the U.S. never joined it. So Japan has withdrawn from the League of Nations in 1933. Later, we'll learn about another nation that withdraws from the League of Nations in 1933. But first, we'll talk about the Spanish Civil War. So Spanish Civil War, obviously this has to do with Spain. We know that Spain has declined considerably. We talked about the Spanish-American War in here. That was the end of the Spanish Empire. But by the time we get to the 1930s, we have a war between two groups, the Republicans and the Nationalists. And these are interesting names. You always have to, kind of ignore the name and really sort of see what's going on underneath there. So the Republicans are essentially a left-wing alliance of communists, all right, various forms of socialists or communists. And so they're not going to get a lot of support from countries like Britain and France, right? Britain and France, the United States, we didn't support socialism or communism, so they're not going to get our support. They do get a little bit of support from the Soviet Union, but obviously the Soviet Union, has its own issues to deal with. But then there's this other group called the Nationalists, and that is a group of monarchists and fascists. All right, well, we tend to like, or at least, some Western nations will side with monarchies, but only monarchies that, sort of promote Western ideas. And that doesn't seem to be the case here, because these guys, the right-wing monarchists and fascists, are sort of allied with Hitler and Mussolini, and so countries like Britain and France sort of see this as a no-win situation. Ultimately, the Nationalists do win. They're led by General Francisco Franco, who becomes the dictator of Spain. Now, technically, during World War II, Spain is going to be neutral. However, it is leaning towards Italy and Germany. It's sympathetic to Italy and Germany, and so we won't get any help from them. All right, so that brings us to Germany, who, is ultimately who we're going to have to talk about. So if we go back to World War I, and we remember that every nation of the Central Powers sort of had its own treaty to deal with. For example, the Ottoman Empire had a treaty, Austria had a treaty. All right, so Germany, the treaty that dealt with Germany was called the Treaty of Versailles. And it was basically a treaty that punished Germany. All right, so Germany is going to lose 10% of its European territory plus all of its colonies. So, Germany's going to lose a lot of land. It's going to be forced to demilitarize, so it's only allowed to keep a small defense force. It can't have like tanks or planes or anything like that, just basically a few 100,000 soldiers to sort of protect it. And it's forced to pay for the war, which means it's got to, pay money to Britain and France. And of course, the U.S. gets involved with that by lending money to Germany, which ultimately is what sort of one of the factors that leads to the Great Depression. But anyway, Germany is in a crippling depression, right? Their depression's worse than ours is. All right, now the German Empire is done. It doesn't exist anymore, but Germany becomes a republic that most people refer to as the Weimar Republic or the Weimar Republic. All right, sometimes in German, depending on what, using German, will W's and V's sound the same, right? So the Weimar Republic or the Weimar Republic, whichever you prefer to say, is what we call this period where Germany is a republic. You can see there the dates 1918 to 1933, so it doesn't last very long, but it is a republic, a German republic, which is interesting because that's what Germany eventually, is today. But this one didn't work out. And one of the problems of their depression is hyperinflation. So their money was worthless. There's actually a picture here of someone using basically, million mark notes, right? So they're using money as basically scrap paper because it was worthless. There's stories of people using their money to wallpaper their houses. Stories of people cashing in, their life savings to try to buy a loaf of bread. So Germany, or the Weimar Republic, they're in bad shape during this time. All right. Now, one of the things that comes out of this crippling depression, all right, is something called the stab in the back myth. And basically, German nationalists, I'm going to stop right here for a minute because I've used this word nationalist several times. All right. Nationalism is not a bad word, right? We've talked about nationalism in here before. Nationalism simply means that this group of people, this people who identify together through their language, through their culture, something, all right, that this group of people basically want a sovereign state for themselves, right? The Cuban nationalists during the Cuban War for Independence, they wanted Cuba to be ruled by Cubans. The Filipino nationalists, they wanted the Philippines to be ruled by Filipinos, right? So nationalism is not a bad word. It today often gets used as a bad word because of World War II. We have things like Japan celebrating ultra-nationalism, Italy, ultra-nationalism, and now German, nationalism, and these end up being the quote-unquote bad guys, right? So the word nationalism becomes associated as a bad thing. But the idea of nationalism by itself is not necessarily bad. It's more, what does it lead to, right? So here we have a lot of German nationalists. These are people who are proud to be German. They want Germany to be ruled by Germans. They want Germany to be successful. They're patriotic. Nothing wrong with any of that, right? But then they go, it's not our fault we lost World War I, right? They're so patriotic that they're saying it cannot be our fault. So whose fault is it, right? And so that's where this stab in the back myth thing comes from. We're like, Okay, well, it's not, clearly not us. It's not, there's nothing wrong with us. So who's, why did we lose the war? And they start looking for other people to blame, right? And so this is how they start to blame other, ideologies like communists. It's how they start to blame other ethnicities like the Jews, right? Anybody but the Germans, okay? Weak politicians, whatever, all right? And so out of this stab in the back myth and this sort of pro-German nationalism, we get a group called the Nazi Party, all right? So the Nazi Party stands for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now here's something that's very interesting, because you will hear people describe the Nazis as the right wing, right? They'll say the right, the alt-right, the right wing, whatever, okay? The name National Socialist German Workers' Party, that is a left-wing name, right? Based on everything we've learned in here, that sounds leftist, right? The National Socialist German Workers' Party. So again, it's interesting that fascism gets tied to the right, but that's what people say. Okay, so the left wing, right wing thing, it can get complicated if you want to use those terms. Be careful how you use them, right? But the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, that is the Nazi Party. All right, but they did embrace German nationalism. That's the key thing, is embracing German nationalism. So they're proud of being German, and they want Germany to be ruled by Germans, and they want what's best for Germans. Right? Again, those things aren't necessarily bad. And I know somebody's listening to this and they're going, "Oh, this guy's apologizing for Nazis or something." That's not what I'm saying. Okay, I have no love for the Nazis. What I'm trying to say is, in itself, nationalism is not a bad thing. It's what you do to promote it or to achieve it, which is ultimately what will define your nationalist movement, which for the Germans we can say was pretty bad, right? All right, so we know who the Nazis are. Let's talk about Adolf Hitler, because he's ultimately going to be the leader of that party. So he is born in Austria, all right, which is interesting, but Austria is German. Right? It's not part of Germany, but it is German. German is an ethnicity. So when we're talking about nationalism, that's identity, that's culture. It's not necessarily the state. Okay. He's a World War I veteran, member of the Nazi Party, believes in this stab in the back myth, believes in promoting German nationalism, all that stuff. Right? And so in 1923, Hitler and some of his buddies, right, the Nazi Party, they're going to try to overthrow the government, right? The government, again, the Weimar Republic, they want to overthrow it, and they are unsuccessful. And so Hitler's going to go to jail, all right? Now, this is called the Beer Hall Putsch. This is their attempt of overthrowing the government, which ultimately winds him up in jail. So you actually see Hitler there in the picture over there on the left, wearing the lederhosen, all right? So while he's in prison, he writes this book, Mein Kampf, right? This is sort of his story, right? And it sort of explains this stab in the back myth, and people read it, and he talks about how he can improve Germany, and he becomes very popular while he's in prison. And so he gets out of prison, and he ends up refounding the Nazi Party, which was technically outlawed, but it becomes even more popular. You can see here that its numbers continue to grow. And by 1933, the Nazi Party is the majority party in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. All right, so the Nazis take control of the parliament. They make Hitler the chancellor. So Hitler's the chancellor. He's in charge of the parliament. And then they pass the Enabling Act of 1933. This basically gives the power of the Reichstag to the chancellor, which is Hitler. So instead of having this parliamentary body, right, they've given over the power basically just to one man, to the chancellor. So Hitler is now ultimately the Reichstag. He has the power all to himself. All right, now because this is a republic, there is a separation of powers, and the president of Germany is a man named Paul von Hindenburg, who does not like Hitler. He doesn't like the Nazis. He is forced to work with them, right, because they have the power in the Reichstag, but he doesn't like them. Now, he dies August 2nd, 1934. Now, remember, Hitler has all the power in the Reichstag. Well, the Reichstag, which he controls, passes a law called Law Concerning the Highest State of Office of the Reich that basically says that when the president dies, that the powers of the president, the office of the president, will merge with the power of the chancellor, which is Hitler. So ultimately, instead of there being a new president, Hitler will now have the power of the president and the power of the Reichstag, the legislature, right? So we see here that Hindenburg dies. So now who has all of the power? Well, Hitler does, all right? So he takes the title of Führer und Reichskanzler, which means leader and chancellor. This is the title he's going to use. And now he basically has total control of Germany. He's going to establish what's called the Third Reich, which means the Third Empire. And he's going to start putting in all of his sort of ultra-nationalist ideas into policy. All right, so he's going to promote German expansion, taking land from other people, expanding Germany's borders. He's going to embrace eugenics, which is the idea of certain biological traits being better than others, and it sort of uses science and genes, genetic science to promote racist ideologies and things like that. He's also going to start building up the military, the Air Force and the Army and things like that, even though technically he's not supposed to. All right, so he's going to exit the League of Nations in 1933, basically throws out the whole Treaty of Versailles when he does this. Now in 1936, he's going to send troops into the Rhineland. The Rhineland is the little German area that borders France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. So this would have been, during World War I, this would have been, the Western Front. He sends troops into that, which he's not supposed to do. And then in 1938, he's going to take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Now, this is a part of Czechoslovakia that has a lot of German-speaking people there. And so his excuse is, hey, I'm just, looking out for the German people, trying to protect the German people. He's using nationalism as the propaganda for doing what he wants to do. Same thing with the Rhineland, sending those troops into there. And then in March of 38, he's going to take Austria, which is German. All right, he's going to unite Austria and Germany. And so we finally have what we talked about previously in other videos, Greater Germany. All right, all the Germans under one roof, so to speak. All right. Now you say, well, how in the world did he get away with all this? Well, remember, we're looking at this in hindsight. We're looking back on World War II. We're saying, what led to World War II, when in reality, they technically don't know that World War II exists yet because it hadn't happened, right? They can't see the future. But they do know that World War I existed. And so they're trying to prevent another war. France doesn't want to go to war again. France is devastated from the last war. Britain doesn't want to go to war again, right? Russia has turned into the Soviet Union. So they're letting Hitler get away with a lot of stuff that he shouldn't have gotten away with because they don't want another war. And in hindsight, maybe something should have been done before Hitler got to the power that he had. But again, that's hindsight. Hindsight's 20/20, as we say. All right. Now, one more thing. During this same time period, the 1930s, Italy, which we know is the fascist government of Italy controlled by Mussolini, They're going to invade Ethiopia, which is in North Africa, and they're going to take over that nation. All right, now the leader, the emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, he says, hey, you know, League of Nations, aren't you guys supposed to prevent this? Isn't this the point of the League of Nations, to stop things like this? And the League of Nations doesn't really do anything because, again, they don't want another war. So we've seen Japan sort of building up its military and then taking over Manchuria, and no one really does anything about it because they don't want to start another war. We've seen Germany building up its military and taking over parts of Europe, and no one does anything about it because they don't really, don't want to start another war. And now we've seen Italy build up its military and move into North Africa, and nobody does anything about it because nobody wants to start another war. And ultimately, we know that it's going to all lead to another war. In fact, it's going to lead to World War II, which is the bloodiest war in the history of the world. But they don't know that, okay? It's easy to look back and say, hey, they made a mistake. They should have done something earlier. But again, we have the advantage of looking back. So in the next video, we will look at the war, all right, World War II. All right, now World War II is big. Like I just said, it's the biggest war in history. We're not going to go into a whole lot of detail. I mean, we will go into a little bit of detail, but we're not going to study, every battle or every conflict of World War II. We're just not going to do that. But we will sort of try to establish a timeline of events and sort of see what happens. So stay tuned for that in the next video. Thank you.